Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Storytime with Grandma Kate. Today I'm going to share a beautiful story written by Patricia Polacco called The Keeping Quilt. Do any of you have a special blanket at home that you love to cuddle up with? Maybe somebody made you a special blanket. Today's story is about a blanket that was shared over generations in a family, and Patricia Polacco's family, actually, and I thought you might enjoy it. I borrowed this one from the Toledo Lucas County Library, so I'll put a link to this book in the description below so you can check it out yourself. Look at all those pictures. You're going to see these pictures in the quilt that's made in this story. I believe they all tell a story too. Let's find out. This book is called The Keeping Quilt. The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. She not only writes the words, but she also draws all the pictures as well. When my great-grandma Anna came to America, she wore the same thick overcoat and big boots she had worn for farm work. But her family weren't dirt farmers anymore. In New York City, her father's work was hauling things on a wagon, and the rest of the family made artificial flowers all day. Everyone was in a hurry, and it was so crowded, not like back home in Russia, but all the same, it was their home, and most of their neighbors were just like them. I like how she does most of the picture in black and white, and then you see this person with a babushka, that's what that's called, on her head. When Anna went to school, English sounded to her like pebbles dropping into shallow water. In 6 months, she was speaking English. Her parents almost never learned, so she spoke English for them too. She is in a pretty dress, babushka. The only things she had left of back home Russia were her dress and babushka she liked to throw into the air when she was dancing. And her dress was getting too small. After her mother had sewn her a new one, she took her old dress and babushka. Then from a basket of old clothes, she took Uncle Vladimir's shirt, Aunt Havela's nightdress, and an apron of Aunt Natasha's. We will make a quilt to help us always remember home, Anna's mother said. It will be like having the family in back home Russia dance around us at night. And so it was. Anna's mother invited all the neighborhood ladies. They cut out animals and flowers from the scraps of clothing. From the scraps of clothing. Anna kept the needles threaded and handed them to the ladies as they needed them. The border of the quilt was made of Anna's babushka. Isn't that pretty? I've read a lot of stories about Amish women that get together and they sit around and make the quilt in the same way here. I can't imagine all the wonderful stories they were telling as they sewed that quilt, all the wonderful stories they wove into it. On Friday nights, Anna's mother would say the prayers that started the Sabbath. The family ate challah and chicken soup, and the quilt was the tablecloth. Isn't that neat? Anna grew up and fell in love with great-grandpa Sasha. To show he wanted to be her husband, he gave Anna a gold coin, a dried flower, and a piece of rock salt, all tied into a linen handkerchief. The gold was for wealth, the flower for love, and the salt so their lives would have flavor. She accepted the hanky, and they were engaged. You can see how they used their quilt. It's like a little picnic blanket. Under the wedding chuppah, Anna and Sasha promised each other love and understanding. After the wedding, the men and women celebrated separately. In Jewish tradition, I guess they do that. Yeah. The chuppah is the covering that they have over the bride and groom when they're having their wedding ceremony together. When my grandmother Carl was born, when my grandma Carl was born, Anna wrapped her daughter in the quilt to welcome her warmly into the world. Carly was given a gift of gold, flour, salt, and bread. Gold so she would never know poverty, a flour so she would always know love, salt so her life would always have flavor, and bread so that she would never know hunger. Carly learned to keep the Sabbath and to cook and clean and do washing. Married you'll be someday, Anna told Carly. And again, the quilt became a wedding chuppah, this time for Carly's wedding to Grandpa George. Men and women celebrated together, but they still did not dance together. In Carly's wedding bouquet were a gold coin, bread, and salt. Carly and George moved to a farm in Michigan, and great-grandma Anna came to live with them. The quilt once again wrapped a new little girl, Mary Ellen. Do you know who Mary Ellen is? Can you guess? Mary Ellen called Anna Lady Grandma. She had grown very old and was sick a lot of the time. The quilt kept her legs warm. On Anna's 98th birthday, the cake was a koolach with a rich cake with raisins and candied fruit in it. They used that as a tablecloth. Quilt is just seeing a lot of wonderful family celebrations. And then, when great-grandma Anna died, prayers were said to lift her soul to heaven. My mother, Mary Ellen, was now grown. And that blanket covered up that sweet old lady. The comfort I'm sure that was for her. When Mary Ellen left home, she took the quilt with her. When she became a bride, the quilt became her chuppah. For the first time, friends who were not Jews came to the wedding. My mother wore a suit, but in her bouquet were gold and bread and salt. It's another tradition that they kept. And then the quilt welcomed me, Patricia, into the world. And it was the tablecloth for my first birthday party. Neat. At night, I would trace my fingers around the edges of each animal on the quilt before I went to sleep. I told my mother stories about the animals on the quilt. She told me whose sleeve had made the horse, whose apron had made the chickens, and whose dress had made the flowers, and whose babushka went all the way around the edge of the quilt. The quilt was a pretend cape when I was in the bull ring, and sometimes a tent in the steaming Amazon jungles. I love that they let her play with that quilt. At my wedding, men and women danced together, and in my bouquet were gold, bread, and salt, and a sprinkle of wine, so I would always know laughter. Of course, they used that quilt as a chuppah, didn't they? Many years ago, I held Tracy Denise in the quilt for the first time. There's Patricia and her baby, her husband. 3 years later, my mother held Stephen John in the quilt for the first time. We were all so proud of Tracy's new big brother. Just like their mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother before them, they too used the quilt to celebrate birthdays and make superhero capes. I love these pictures. They have so much to tell. You could tell a whole story about each one, couldn't you? As the years passed and Tracy and Stephen were growing up, their grandmother took pleasure at every family gathering to tell the story of the quilt. We all knew whose clothes made each flower an animal. My mother was lucky enough to show the wonder of this quilt to my brother's grandchildren, her great grandchildren. Amazing. All those generations of people telling the story of that quilt. When my mother died, prayers were said to lift her soul to heaven. Tracy and Stephen were now all grown and getting ready to start their own lives. That picture tells a story all its own, doesn't it? But still, it says, and now I wait for the day that I too soon will be a grandmother and tell the story of the keeping quilt to my grandbabies. This book was written a long time ago. I used to share it when I taught first grade, so I will bet you that Patricia Polacco has shared this with many of her grandbabies. But before we go today, I want to share my quilt with you. When I was a very little girl, my great-grandmother, my dad's grandmother, used to stay with us, and she would always be sewing on a quilt. She made a baby quilt for me. And this quilt, I can only show you part of it, but this was my grandfather's quilt that was on his bed that my great-grandmother, his mother, made for him. And when he passed away, I was lucky enough to be given this quilt. And sometimes I keep it on my bed, but most of the time I use it when I'm relaxing or practicing yoga. I just use it as a blanket to cover myself. And I always think about my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my grandfather when I have it out. So I hope you've enjoyed this story about many generations in the same family and the wonderful traditions they have. You might want to talk to your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa about some of the things that have been passed down in your family as well. So until I see you next time, enjoy your day.